So hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm really pleased to introduce you Julian Michaels. He did his PhD at UW with Luke Zotermeyer, worked on semantic role labeling and some cool annotation processes. But now he moved to the dark side to work on alignment with Sam Bauman in NYU. And today we'll talk about the NLP Metasurvey. So thanks, Julian.
I think this is hopefully going to be kind of a little bit more of a discussion, because I think this paper is kind of like about discussion. But first, I should probably kind of introduce the whole topic. So you might have seen this headline. Hopefully you didn't. If you did, I just want to say I'm sorry. And I can explain. And that's what we're going to do today. So, I don't particularly fear Judgment Day from robots, but it is true that NLP technology is changing really fast. And I have a concern, which is kind of like one layer removed from, what is happening to AI, and more about what's happening to us as a community, right? Because with all the changes that we're seeing, it's become increasingly hard to predict where things are going to be in like a year, right? Or 2 years, right? The near future technological developments are getting kind of like crazy. And I think this is sending a lot of people into a space of very high uncertainty, right? And where you have uncertainty, you have disagreement, as any of us who have annotated data probably knows. There's also the fact that NLP systems are being deployed a lot more than they were just a few years ago. And so a lot of questions that maybe wouldn't have felt relevant to ask a few years ago about the ethics and about the impact of such deployments now suddenly feel very relevant. And so on one hand, we have a lot of uncertainty, which leads to disagreement between people about, the state of our technology and where it's going. And then we also have a lot of latent disagreement that is now being discussed openly, right? So the upshot is that we have a lot of questions which are suddenly relevant and which are kind of difficult to discuss well, right? So now a lot of people are seriously considering questions like, is artificial general intelligence something we should be thinking about? What kinds of models is it unethical or ethical to develop and deploy? Like, you wouldn't be worried about this if your model didn't work at all, as they did kind of a few years ago, right? Now they kind of work. So now we have to face okay, now that we can, should we, right? And also, what's the role of academia versus industry research with all of the dependence on scale of recent developments? So, and many more. I'm sure that we all have a lot of questions like this in our head and in our Twitter feeds, if we are unfortunate enough to have Twitter accounts. And I think that the presence of a lot of this disagreement can present a difficulty, because I think it's really hard to actually know what NLP researchers think as a group. It's very tempting to think that we know, because we constantly hear opinions on all of these questions, right? We hear them expressed in papers, at conferences, at work, on Twitter, and it's very easy to start to get a sense that, okay, I think I know the landscape, right? I've heard from a bunch of different people and what they think, but the reality is we're not that small of a community, and that more than 80% of what you're hearing is probably coming from less than 20% of the people, right? And I think it matters to know what the majority of the people think, because the majority of the people are the people who are actually reading your work and deciding what to do on the basis of it, right? The people who are actually reviewing your work, right? The people who are actually controlling the popularity of ideas and what gets done. And so I think it's a problem that we don't know our own community that well. If we have bad models of each other, it just makes it more difficult to communicate, especially in the research setting. So if you don't know what your colleagues actually think, you might avoid researching promising topics because you don't think they would ever pass review, right? Or you might spend a lot of extra effort trying to defend views and even doing projects to kind of prove something that most people don't think you need to prove. They would be perfectly happy for you to skip to the next step, right? And I think this is one of the kind of worst and most noticeable culprits, is you might argue on the basis of assumptions which aren't shared by your audience. You might basically take your own views, or maybe take the popularity of an opposing view for granted and argue on the basis of that. And when your audience doesn't share your assumptions, they stop listening. And so I see a kind of potential, or already existent, worst case scenario here of, fractured discourse where you have disparate echo chambers built around totally different sets of assumptions, and we can't actually constructively build on each other's work because we don't even speak the same vocabulary to each other. So this hinders progress and it creates needless fights. So what can we do about it? Well, we run a survey. We just ask people what they think on a bunch of ostensibly controversial issues. So we ran a survey. This ran from May to June last year, and it's called the NLP Community Metasurvey. And I'll get to the name in a bit. But at the end of the day, we got 327 ACL, like actively publishing ACL authors to answer 33 controversial, or we thought they might be controversial. Many of them were, it turns out, questions about NLP. And the format, we tried to keep as simple as possible so we can analyze the data. Basically, for each question, we state some opinion, like private firms have too much influence in guiding the trajectory of the field. So these are often opinions or value statements, just something that someone can hold, doesn't necessarily need to be verifiable or falsifiable. And then we ask, do you agree or disagree? And so they answer on this kind of 4-point Likert scale. We did not have a middle of the scale because we don't want to have a dumping ground. We want people to take a stance, right? Do you agree or disagree with the statement? But, if you don't actually know enough to have an opinion, you could say insufficiently informed on the issue. You could also say question is ill-posed because, as is the nature of controversial issues, even the vocabulary is often controversial. And you could just avoid answering entirely, as is required by IRB. But also, you don't want people to feel cornered. Sometimes they kind of like don't give you like honest responses as a result. But we didn't just run a survey to get people's opinions. We called it a meta survey, and this was inspired by a project that was undertaken in the philosophy community called the Phil Papers surveys, where they ran a survey of philosophical beliefs on various issues, and then a paired meta survey where your task was basically to predict the results of the first survey. And this was seen as very interesting because if our whole point is to understand what the community thinks, if we can measure what it currently thinks, then we can highlight the mismatches and the places where we might need to update our views, and we can kind of hold ourselves accountable to our sociological beliefs as a community. So it's a very interesting question of like, what are these false sociological beliefs where our perceptions don't match reality? So the way we implemented this was for each of those statements I mentioned, you just have another scale where you can choose between 5 buckets of how many people do you think are going to agree with the statement. And to make this concrete, of course, you have to have an idea of what set of people you're making predictions about. So we told people what our target demographic was, and this is what all of our analysis is restricted to, is people who had published or co-authored at least 2 papers in ACL venues in the last 3 years. And since this was like early mid-2022, we just considered 2019 and on. And so 327 that I said earlier is the number of kind of people in our target demographic who answered the survey. And that's basically it for the structure of the survey. But there is another idea behind the meta survey, which I think makes it interesting. There's this idea of crowd wisdom by choosing surprisingly popular answers, which is, if you want to know, for example, you want to know, for example, a fact that might only be known to a subset of the population, but could be subject to popular misconception. Crowd wisdom by majority vote probably will fail in this case, right, due to the misconception. But if you choose the answer that's most surprisingly popular, by comparing people's actual answers versus what they predict the answers will be, this actually performs better than majority vote, even with confidence weighting in a bunch of different scenarios. And it's seen as a way of kind of like tapping into the small set of experts in the crowd, people who kind of have access to some extra information that helps them understand, oh, this is the answer, but most people probably don't know this. Of course, like, it's not a hard rule, and it definitely doesn't fully apply in our case because we're talking about opinions, value judgments, and things that can't really be objectively measured. in these cases. And so I wouldn't say that something being surprisingly popular here is very strong evidence that it's true, but I think that this principle can give us a starting point for thinking about, like, why does this mismatch exist in each case? Like, why do people think they have some kind of specialized knowledge? Yes.
Can you just elaborate more on what this surprisingly popular, like how that's computed?
Yeah. So basically you have a question like, for example, you have a question like, is Philadelphia the capital of Pennsylvania? Yes or no? And then you have people vote like yes or no, according to what they think. And then you have people basically say how popular they think the yes answer is going to be and the no answer is going to be. And then you average both of those, right? And so you can compare the average expected popularity of an answer according to the participants to the actual popularity. And the difference between the two is how kind of surprisingly popular it is. And if you use that, like max surprising popularity as a selection strategy for like crowd wisdom voting, it actually works pretty well in like a few settings. So that was what this Nature paper was showing back in 2017. And the thinking is that basically, instead of just comparing people who think the answer is yes versus number of people who think the answer is no, you're comparing the number of people who think that the answer is yes, but other people will say no, and the people who think the answer is no, but the other people will say yes. So you're only looking at the people who think that they disagree with the crowd. And so it relies on the idea that these people who think that they're in the minority tend to have access to more information than the people who think that they're in the majority. It's not always true, and you can imagine how it especially won't be true in the case of value questions and the questions of the kind that we have in this survey. So I just want to be very clear, like, we are trying to describe the field's opinions. We're not trying to like find the true answers here. Does that make sense?
So, but since you are averaging over all the responses, there is like, you're kind of, it would indicate that a large number of people think they're in the minority, right? Or if the gap is large.
If the gap is large, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sounds right.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So that's basically it for like the framing. And please let me know if you have any other questions. But I think it's important next to kind of go over our respondent population a bit, because there are some very important kind of elements of context for interpreting the results here. So there was a very interesting skew in the, we measured like 13 demographic variables just for some more context, right? And there was some skew in the distribution across careers and jobs. So our respondents skewed academic. It was like almost 3/4 of people were in academia, and they skewed especially senior. And I think compared to the ACL population as a whole, we don't have statistics on this as far as I could find, but it seems like I would think that there are more students plus postdocs, right? I would think there are more students than faculty, but we actually had a plurality of like faculty and senior managers answer the survey. I don't know exactly what explains it, but it might give you a sense of like, what are the kind of people who are kind of dominating the opinions here? And the academia skew is especially important for some of the questions related to industry and academia. In terms of location, there was also a kind of interesting selection bias here. Here I'm comparing the portion of survey respondents in blue to ACL statistics from ACL memberships in gray. And it tracked mostly with the exception of the United States and Asia. So the US is way overrepresented, even though it's already the most kind of popular region of residence for ACL members. But Asia is deeply underrepresented, and a large part of this is China. India as well, but especially with China. And we actually noticed this as we were running a survey, and then we tried kind of like to expand the reach a bit. We sent out a bunch of emails to like top publishing authors in ACL, which included a lot of people at Chinese institutions. And one of the co-authors posted about it on WeChat, but we just didn't get much traction among Chinese ACL members, or ACL members based in China, I should say. And like probably one of the reasons for that is that a lot of our survey respondents probably are in our personal network and found it through Twitter, right? So but in terms of gender, it seemed a little bit more representative. So here we're comparing to ACL diversity statistics from ACL Vancouver 2017, which was like the last statistics that we could find. So it's not necessarily representative of the membership or our target demographic, but it's a proxy. And I think 25% or so women kind of accords with probably a lot of our personal experience. So yeah, but it is also important to consider that like the views represented in the survey are largely the views of men. And sometimes there are significant differences between men and women. The final thing to consider is the Twitter bias, which I think I've already mentioned. So like 3/4 of the people who answered the survey have a Twitter. Almost a fifth of them actually routinely post on Twitter, which is like, this is a very small population of people, right? So it's worth considering that. I still think that the results of the survey are probably meaningful because what we're talking about here is the public discourse, right? And the public discourse does happen a lot on Twitter. So it's like, I think it still makes sense to talk about, but it's just worth keeping in mind. Yeah, and like more than a third of people found the survey through Twitter as well. Yes.
Do you have a sense of how many NLP researchers use Twitter?
I don't actually know. Yeah, that's a good question. Doesn't someone here have like a big Twitter list of like NLP researchers or something? No, okay. Yeah, I don't know, especially like specifically ACL published authors. I can tell you that there were, I can't remember the exact number, but on the order of like 4,000 to 6,000 people in our target demographic, people have like published 2 papers in ACL venues in the last 3 years. And like we covered something almost 5% of them or something like that. So so we're like getting a reasonable subset of the community, although it's certainly going to be biased. Okay, so let's get to the fun part and discuss some results. We split up the survey into various kind of thematic sections. And I'm kind of gonna go by those sections. I'm not gonna cover every question in the survey. If you have questions, we can also like go over anything you're interested in. Also, like, please feel free to speak up during the talk. I think like the most interesting thing that we can all get out of this is just like having multiple perspectives on how to interpret these results, because I tried my best, but probably some people here answered the questions on the survey, and like maybe you have like an alternative like reason that someone might give a particular answer. So the first few questions I want to go over are about kind of the state of NLP as a field. And in particular, we had a couple of questions on industry versus academia. And so the first question on the survey was, private firms have too much influence in guiding the trajectory of the field. So this kind of like, yeah, industry is too influential. And then the second one says that industry is going to produce the most widely cited papers. And people agreed with both of these, right? And that's consistent. But I think it's consistent with this idea that like industry is probably having some kind of negative impact on the field, right? Because they're clearly people think that it's going to be dominant, but they think it's having too much influence. So it's probably maybe a little bit too dominant. Another thing that's interesting here, and I should probably take some time to kind of go over how to read these charts, is that both of these views were more popular than predicted. So the way that this chart is structured is the blue corresponds to agree. So we have agree and weakly agree in the lighter blue, and the red corresponds to disagreeing. And these are arranged kind of like volumetrically, so that the point at which weakly agree and weakly disagree meet is kind of like at the proportion of people who agree. And so that's why I highlighted in green. And then we have a 95% bootstrap confidence interval here, based on the size of the survey population and the people who answered agree or disagree on these questions. On top of the bar, we have basically a bar graph that corresponds to the predictions that people made in the meta question, right? So that's why we have 5 bars, because there were 5 buckets corresponding to 0 to 20%, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. And in the black here, we have the mean prediction if we just kind of like average the center of all of the predicted buckets. And that's also a 95% confidence interval, although 95% confidence interval on like the averaged values of a bunch of buckets, like you take it with a grain of salt, but it gives you an idea, rough idea of the kind of statistical power that we have here, right? So like whether you should kind of take the difference seriously. But there was like a pretty big difference here. And one of the potential reasons for this is the academic skew. So as you can imagine, there was a big difference between academics and people who worked in for-profit companies answering these questions. So academics thought that industry had too much influence at a much higher rate. And so if you're predicting the views of the field, what is your concept of the population of ACL authors? Maybe the people you have in mind are, oh, you're thinking about like the language model people, or you're thinking about the industry people or whatever, right? So, it's more popular than was expected, but there are multiple things that could mean. Yes.
So this 20 points for you is big surprisal. I guess when you're looking at the difference between validity or not, what it's like your threshold between this is a big one, a small one.
I don't think I have necessarily authority on that. So I
Okay.
think you should kind of like come to your own conclusion.
Okay.
To me, I think 20 points is pretty big.
I mean, just like looking at like the average. gap,
yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's like on the upper end.
This is on the upper end. This is on the upper end. There are some bigger gaps, which we'll get to, but this is on the upper end. Yeah, and I think that the effect size is kind of the more interesting thing to look at than the like statistical significance here, which is why I'm not giving p-values, although they're generally small, even though I'm not sure how much they mean. Yeah, so there's another question which was kind of interesting. I was kind of iffy about whether we should include it in the survey at all, because there are a lot of different things it could mean. But if you say a majority of the research being published in NLP is of dubious scientific value, you get a lot of agreement. So what do we think this means? Does it mean that most papers are kind of marginal and like the results probably won't hold up that long, but people are kind of messing around and eventually they'll make progress? Or does it mean that we are like so misguided that like we're asking questions that don't even make sense, right? So it could mean anything along these lines. And it's hard to say exactly what people thought, and this is an interesting thing about the meta survey, because even if you dispute the interpretation of a question, I think whatever you think about how that question was interpreted should apply equally to the question and the meta question. And so if we compare the actual with the predicted rate, that still is kind of meaningful, regardless of your interpretation of the question. And so what this tells us is that people seem to think, I mean, of course, these predictions are fairly spread out, but they seem to think that like there is, about half of the community who thinks that what we're doing makes sense. But a lot of people are thinking like, yeah, everyone thinks NLP is like, makes sense and is good, but like, we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what's going on. Like we have some secret cynics here. That's the best take that I can get on it. Although, if anyone has other ideas.
You have a breakdown of this by seniority.
So
Senior people just gave it.
let's find out. Okay, so this is not available publicly because I need to refactor it in order to make sure to preserve everyone's privacy. But what we can do is we can ask, let's see, your demographics. If your demographic,
A live demo, that's bold.
it is. It might just bug out, like who knows. But so we want to look at their career position, and then we want to see. We want to see we're in dubious scientific value. That's in state of the field, right? Most of NLP is dubious science. Let's see what happens. Okay, so if we look at the proportion who agree compared to the role, this might be a little small for people to see. This is not, most of the presentation was not supposed to take up this format, but here what we have are 95% bootstrap confidence intervals for the rate of weekly agree versus disagree, weekly disagree, kind of split up by seniority. And there doesn't seem to be a significant difference here. So like, of course, when we're splitting up the data this much, our statistical power is weakened, but also like, even if we had stronger statistical power, I'm not seeing evidence of a strong effect size here. Yeah, so.
I'm also curious about the questions about industry versus academics. Do you know that off the top of your head, or?
Well, if you want to say private firms have too much influence versus job sector, that's, I guess, what we want to test here. There is a big difference here, right? So here we have like between 80 and 85% of academics are like, yeah, too much influence, but between 55 and 60% of industry people think so. That's still a majority. So interesting.
Other surveys like this in other fields I was wondering about like the dubiousness of the field. General trend in the
That would be very interesting. I don't know. I don't know how many people are willing to kind of put a stake in that particular question and then kind of like solicit opinions on it. I don't think there was such a question in the in the Phil Papers surveys, and yeah, I'm not sure. But of course, like there has been a lot of public discussion of doubts of the kind of scientific value of things in like psychology and social psychology, where people are very worried about the experiments generalizing either statistically or to demographics outside of their typical demographics. And yeah, I mean, we're definitely not the only field suffering from such a problem, but I don't know about surveys. Yeah.
I wonder if this question sort of points out one of the possible failure modes of the meta survey approach, because you were saying like it depends on the interpretation for both the like question and the meta question being the same. But if people are thinking about like their own research when they're thinking about their answer, or sorry, they're thinking about other people's like research, then I don't know, it's like basically you're going to be less dubious of your own work than other people's work, and that sort of splits that up.
Yeah, it is hard to necessarily tease that apart. We did gather demographic information on people's subfields, but of course this question was not split up by that. It's something that we could look at, but I think we should move on. There are lots more interesting questions. But
Sorry, I guess I have a question about like, the temporality of all of this, because particular period is something that this is basically like a snapshot in time, right?
yes.
So I was wondering if you had any sense of how this changes, when does it change, and how to read on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's one that I'm probably not more capable of answering than you are until, maybe we run another iteration of the survey. My sense is that perhaps some of these things have changed in the past year just because of some, various developments, like, ChatGPT is probably a relevant development. I don't know how much people actually update their beliefs when new things happen. I think that's an open question. So yeah, I don't know. Okay, but then we have some very, very interesting results to go over related to scale and interdisciplinary science. So the first one was actually one of the biggest deltas that we had between actual and predicted percentages. So, and it's worth like detailing this view in particular because I think it's a very kind of like interesting subset of the field that we might be interested in thinking about. Which I'm going to kind of refer to this group of people as like scaling maximalists, or the idea as scaling maximalism. So the statement here is that, given the resources, like the hardware resources and the economic resources that are going to come around this century, just scaling up the kinds of models that we currently have will basically solve any problem that you need to solve. Right? This is kind of like a maybe strong-ish version of the scaling hypothesis, is another way that you might have heard it talked about. And this is like an idea that is clearly in the water, right, with all of the progress on scale. But it's also hotly debated, and it's one that I think we've all probably experienced community members talking about it as like, oh, everyone just cares about scale. All people care about is scale these days, right? And people kind of think that, right? So they thought on average, and of course these predictions are also very spread out. So there's a lot of disagreement with people about the state of the community. But on average, they thought probably about half of people would hold this view. And this is a very strong view. I don't know, in my opinion, maybe the people who agree with it don't think so. But not to say it's necessarily wrong, but it's still strong. And so half of the community believing it, that's a very strong belief about NLP researchers, but only 17% of the respondents actually did. And I think it's really interesting. And it raises questions about like, how could such a potential misconception come about? Like, it's also worth thinking about like, okay, our survey demographic, again, it's academics and it's senior people. These are people who are established, who probably made their careers off of things that are not scale, who probably don't have the resources to do scale. And as we saw, in the industry question, probably they're predicting on the basis of their sense of industry researchers, at least as much as academic ones, right? So there are a lot of caveats here, but I think like it might illustrate how kind of hype dominated our field is, right? And the influence of things, perhaps like Twitter, where it's like, if something has a lot of hype, it's very tempting to think that a lot of people are hyped by it, but it might be just a few people who are very hyped. Right? I don't know. But of course, like other people might have different interpretations. Yeah, and I have some more relevant questions to go through, but feel free to interrupt at any time. So these are kind of related questions about, these are kind of normative. So that was like a descriptive question. These are kind of normative questions about like, what should we be doing? So I see it as a kind of separate issue, but of course it's related, right? We have a large majority thinking that the field is focusing too much on scale, and also too much on benchmarks. And both of these views were underpredicted. So that's kind of consistent with it, an intuitive connection to the previous question. And the flip side of that, and maybe calling these trend reversals, that might be a little bit spicy, but I think it's not unreasonable, is that if we look at the things that aren't scale, so things like linguistic structure or inductive biases that are designed by experts and incorporating the systems, or insights from linguistics and cognitive science, the view that these things are going to be necessary to kind of like solve some hard problems in the kind of near to medium term future, it's controversial, right? It's about half of people who think that, you know, we'll need that stuff, which is probably fewer than 10 years, probably much less than 10 years ago. But this actually was more popular than predicted, right? So if there's a subset of people who thinks like, oh, we're all just focusing too much on scale and like we need to understand language better, and they think they're kind of alone, like maybe there are other people sitting alone in their offices feeling the same way. I don't know. But it's also interesting that I think this is a kind of trend reversal, right? Like if you look at the developments of the past 5-10 years, like a lot of what people have been doing is kind of like moving away from incorporating these kinds of explicit structures, like reducing the amount of inductive bias in the models and increasing the amount of data that you're training on. And so since that's the trend, there are really a lot of people who believe that this trend will reverse at some point. And so I'm very curious to know what people think that will look like. Now, I'm one of these people, so I don't mean to like say that it's not reasonable to have this view, but I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of diversity in people's opinions on how this would happen or why. So if anyone has a particular opinion they'd like to share, feel free. But another kind of interesting aspect of this is the linguistics and cognitive science question. So the last question here is saying that linguistics or cognitive science, some specific result from recent progress in linguistics or cognitive science is going to be incorporated into a highly cited system. This is a very strong claim, right? Like these days, like neurons, attention, like these are not new ideas, right? Like, but the idea that some discovery that has been made or will be made is going to be incorporated into one of these top models. Again, a lot of people seem to think this. Maybe that means we should have a conversation about what that's going to look like, because I don't know if I've seen that conversation, but it sounds like there are a lot of people who want to have it. And this question, which is related, was I think the second largest gap after the scale question in the survey. And I think it expresses something similar. So the opinion that compared to what we're doing right now, we should make more efforts to incorporate insights from interdisciplinary sciences or from other related sciences, maybe related to the domain that we're working on, maybe related to cognition, this sort of thing. And like a vast majority of people agreed with this. It's like one of the most popular statements in the survey, but people thought only about half on average would agree. And I think it's really interesting that such a misconception can happen, right? Because you'd think that people are going to do research that aligns with their values. And then if they're doing that research, other people are going to see that. But we have a bunch of people who are sitting around thinking we really should do more interdisciplinary stuff, but they think no one else thinks so because probably they look out and they don't see that much happening. So like, what would cause that? I think there are a few different ways of looking at it. I think one is that we should incorporate more interdisciplinary insights. It's kind of easy to say. It's defensible. People aren't going to attack you for saying it. Whereas like you might kind of get pushback if you say the opposite. I think it also may be evidence of a form of wishful thinking. where it's like, we should do this, but maybe we just don't know how. Like, it seems like a nice idea, but like, we don't know what the right tools are. And I think, to me, and this is definitely my personal opinion, like this may be evidence of like lack of communication or difficulty of communication with interdisciplinary sciences and with other fields, and difficulty of translating their tools and insights to our field. And I think there are a lot of potential reasons for that. But I personally was actually very surprised by this result. I thought that the agreement would be like a small minority here, because I thought that our field had become quite jaded. You know, I'm not going to quote Fred Jelinek here, but like the lessons of the neural network revolution or whatever are kind of like, it's interesting that a lot of people really want to push back, right? They want to change things. Yeah. So that was one of the kind of most interesting and kind of strongest results, I think, of the survey.
I don't remember, for a survey you track who the respondents think is gonna answer the survey. It's like a meta question or project. I don't remember if you had that one or not.
No, we didn't. That's interesting. We could have made the demographic section have a meta survey as well.
I mean, because a lot of NLP happens outside of CL conferences. A lot of the things that you can consider part of NLP happen, you know, ML conferences. And that might skew, like if I think of, oh, there's going to be more ML-oriented people responding to the survey, I'm going to put my confidence in sense lower than if I think it's just CL, ACL respondents.
Yeah. So the predictions, we told them specifically these are going to be published ACL authors, right? Or published in ACL venues, like including all the conferences. So that much was specific. I still think that leaves a lot of kind of room, right? Especially academia versus industry. Like, what is your concept of the composition of the field of ACL researchers? I think there was a recent paper that looked at citation networks between America and Europe versus China, and they're like quite independent from each other, right? So it's like your concept of the field might be the people who you read and you cite, but like it might actually also correspond to its own bubble, right? Okay, so these are the results that most of the news outlets were interested in. But we can start with language understanding. This one was kind of funny, because this question of, do language models understand language? And by the way, the wording of the question here is Bender approved. Like we did a bunch of pilots to kind of like make sure these questions aren't leading. And we structured the section very carefully, because like everyone says, well, what do you mean by understand, right? So is it even meaningful to try to ask people to agree or disagree with the question of like whether language models understand language? The way that we approached this was we were like, answer the question according to the definition you think we should use of understanding. Because actually, I think a lot of the arguments that we have in the field are actually about terminology, about how we should use terminology. I think if we gave a definition of understanding, we would inevitably miss the issue that people are actually arguing about.
Someone has the full chat.
Oh, if someone has a chat, do they want to relate Valentina's question?
Yeah, Julia mentioned news articles that were interested in these results. How did the news discuss the survey?
I'll get to that in a moment. Yeah. Okay, so I thought it was very interesting that this was exactly split down the middle on language models understanding language. It was also interesting that people expected it to be split down the middle. So this is an example of a controversy that actually is a controversy, right? Like people clearly disagree on this. I think, Luca, you might have said everything as it should be, right? Like, yes, perfect balance. My hope is only that the people on either side of the spectrum can have productive conversations with each other. And this is actually one of the particular things that I was kind of worried about and wanted to address with the survey, is that I think for some of this kind of question, you have people come out and like make arguments that presume their answer is already right, right? And it's okay to think that your answer is already right, right? Of course, you believe in your beliefs. But if you're trying to communicate with the field as a whole, and if you're trying to kind of like argue and make intellectual progress as a group, then I think like it's important to know, okay, half of people are going to disagree with my premise here, and I'm making the active choice of screening off that half of my audience. when I assume the premise. And is it appropriate for me to make that choice? Or do I want to communicate in a way that I think will increase the accessibility of my argument? Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons that it's important to kind of have this context. And of course, there's a multimodal issue where like people seem to think that multimodality will help the case. It's hard to imagine that the number would go down. But maybe this gives a rough sense of how promising people think that kind of thing is. And then we get to artificial. Oh, yes.
Would people re-answer 4.1 after answering 4.2?
Yes. So the way that the survey was presented was each of these sections, and I have kind of reordered the questions for this presentation, but each of the sections, like 4, for example, which was the language understanding section, they were presented as like a single page, and you could go through and answer and then make your predictions. So yeah, and then I don't think you could go back. It's possible that you could. I don't remember exactly how the Qualtrics worked on this.
The ordering of the questions would have made some difference in what understand means and multimodal means.
I think it's possible. Yeah, I tried to prime people. Like I had a little paragraph at the beginning about language understanding and about how, use your own definition. I think that the order almost certainly matters, but it's very hard to predict like exactly how. I mean, we could have randomized the order of the questions and tested that sort of thing. I'm not sure if we would have gotten enough statistical power to say anything meaningful is the challenge there with like 300 something respondents. But it's definitely interesting to think about, especially if you're like running a larger survey of this kind. Yeah, so artificial general intelligence is another controversy that's kind of similar. And this, so here we tried to kind of phrase it in a way that would kind of be accessible to a wide range of views. Like just, we should be thinking about AGI, whatever that means. I actually had the same exact instructions about the term artificial general intelligence as I did with language understanding, because this is another thing where it's like one of the main conflicts is over how to define it. And actually, in some sense, this is a question, these are questions about the definition, but couched in questions about reality, right? Because what else is a definition but a connection between a word and reality? Here, the field also seemed to have a pretty reasonable sense of where it was at. Although there are still some people probably surprised to find that like a majority are concerned about AGI. I'm very curious what this would have looked like 5 years ago. But answers to question 3.2 give us a little bit of a hint, right? That like a lot of people think that recent progress in scale is like some kind of meaningful step towards AGI. I think this is another question where like you see a lot of people dismissing alternative views, right? And like when a majority of respondents, and these are mostly, remember, it's like a lot of senior faculty and like senior managers who are expressing their opinions here. This isn't just like, new naive people who haven't been exposed to NLP research and have been brainwashed by AI hype. It could be senior, well-educated, venerable people who have been brainwashed by AI hype. Right? No, to be clear, that was tongue-in-cheek. I think, I don't know, brainwashing is universal, but point being, it might be something that we should be talking about, like even, and maybe especially if you disagree, right? Because there are a lot of people who are taking the idea very seriously. And if you don't take those people seriously, then they might just form their own echo chamber that doesn't include you. And you can decide how you want to feel about that. Beyond AGI, there are questions about what will actually happen as AI capabilities improve or as AI is deployed in new ways. So we asked this question about revolutionary societal change. That's societal changes on at least the scale of the Industrial Revolution, and whether advances in AI could plausibly lead to it. This is also a very strong claim. Like, and that might be one of the difficulties in interpreting the results of this survey, is like maybe not everyone has the same concept of the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution, it was like it was a massive, massive change to society, and it sprung all kinds of things, right? Like the internet revolution alone is crazy enough, but it's like a product of the Industrial Revolution. And so we're talking about totally radical restructuring of society here. I'm not sure if everyone like thought about it as that extreme of a thing when they were answering this question, but the fact that 73% of people agreed with this shows that like people think things are going to get weird, right? And people think that our research is going to have some kind of massive impact on society. So again, it might be worth thinking about what that's going to look like and how that potential impacts the work that you want to do today.
Why did you ask her about AI and ML and not NLP?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that like the distinction between AI and NLP for the purposes of a question like this, I'm not sure how meaningful it is. Like, I'm not sure where the distinction would be. You know what I mean? Like, if someone thinks that AI might do it, but NLP won't, like, I don't know. I think I'm interested in like seeing what NLP researchers think. But if someone thinks that AI is going to lead to Industrial Revolution recap, but like not NLP specifically, like that's a very specific kind of view to have.
Sure, but
I guess,
all
yeah.
these questions are very specific. Right?
That's true. Yeah, I don't know. I guess we didn't feel the need to like make it that specific here. I think like another thing is that like, and I might get to this in the discussion, although actually we're kind of running out of time. There are so many great questions on this survey, right? But I think that like, in terms of the precision of the outcomes that we're talking about, like we're NLP researchers. Like our job is to do NLP research. It's not to forecast the future of NLP research or predict like societal developments. So, and this gets to question 3.4, right? AI decisions could cause nuclear level catastrophe, right? Here I'm saying at least as bad as all-out nuclear war could be caused by like an AI's decision. Now, how much do we know about like geopolitics, right? And about like global catastrophes, right? Like, are we really the right people to like be predicting this kind of thing? I think no, but I'm not really interested in like predicting it. I'm interested in like seeing what people's attitudes are. And so like the way that these questions were kind of designed was almost to like, let's see if I can take this issue that I know people are discussing and like point at it in a way that's somewhat neutral, so people can kind of like tell me which camp they sit in. With a lot of these things like language models understanding language, it's like, yeah, what camp are you in almost, right? Is really the question that's being asked. And so, you know, if there are details of the outcome that's being predicted that, you know, maybe matter in the real world, but like I don't necessarily see like a clear social distinction between the people who kind of have these beliefs, then like, it wasn't necessarily the main interest here. So
the thing that's interesting about this pair is that so 3.4 was expecting to be a lot worse, right? Because in my mind, when I read it, it's like, oh, this is second order effects. Like, who knows? You know, someone puts fake news here, not that when it boosts it up, it's and you know, it causes something bad.
right.
But so I think like when looking at these, maybe second order effect are things that people think about when thinking about 3.3 and like the positive of it.
Yeah.
But then 3.4, when I was talking to people, they said, well, unless a nuke is launched by an AI, then it's no, you know, it's not an AI decision. So that was kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know exactly what people had in mind. I looked at the kind of survey feedback because there was a little freeform like feedback box in each section of the survey, and there were some complaints about this question. I mean, there were complaints about a lot of the questions. I love reading complaints. It really it's a window into people's kind of inner turmoil, or outer turmoil. But yeah, my sense was that like there was probably a subset here who was thinking about kind of like second order and geopolitical kind of disasters, and there was probably also a camp that was thinking maybe kind of about Terminator style, like doomsday from misaligned AGI kind of in the vein of this like AI alignment kind of vision here. And I think actually, so to revisit Valentina's question about the news coverage, people thought this was really interesting. And you got news headlines saying like a third of scientists fear judgment day from robots, right? But, you know, fear is one thing. Thinking something is plausible is another thing, right? Like if you want to say, if someone asks you, is this plausible? Then if you say no, you're going to be very embarrassed when it happens. And so we want to protect ourselves from embarrassment. That's like most of what we do when we think and try to draw conclusions is we want to protect ourselves from embarrassment, right? I assume that's just how everyone works. And so if someone's not kind of in the frame of mind of a scientist who's trying to say like, okay, like one can imagine such a scenario, which might be what people were reading when they read plausible, and they just kind of read every other word in the sentence and they're like, they fear the apocalypse, right? And this kind of like, I think they saw an opportunity for clicks or something like that. And so almost every news article that was published about this, this survey had either a nuclear explosion or a picture of a very threatening looking robot. Almost, actually, you know, it was IFL Science that did the best reporting, which surprised me. Like it was not sensationalized. They just kind of were very serious about it, and they included the caveats and the selection bias. I was like, good job, IFL Science. Like the world is changing.
Yeah, just to keep track.
Oh yeah, we have a few. Okay, so I mean, there are lots more questions that we could discuss kind of offline if you're interested in digging in more. Like I can maybe do some ad hoc explorations of the interface when we're meeting later, but hopefully I will get something along those lines uploaded publicly at some point soon. Yeah, there were a bunch of questions on ethics. I think we don't really have the time to go through all of these, but I can very briefly summarize the results. People think NLP is good. They think it has a good impact on the world in the past and that it will in the future. And they actually think it's better than most people think it is. This is natural. We're all working on NLP. If we really thought it was that bad, we would probably self-select out of the field, one would think. Not me. I'm just kidding. There's this controversy of well, I mean, yeah, lots of things can be dubious besides scientific value. Yeah, so there's this so if you remember, actually, I can't remember a particular controversy about this, but every once in a while it comes up, right? What responsibility does a researcher bear for like what happens when a system that they facilitated the building of was deployed? This was the kind of thing we were trying to capture in this statement. And we had a majority say, yes, this is unethical for a researcher to do this. Of course, there are caveats because like there are kind of gradations of responsibility. It's very, very hard to capture that in a question like this, but you get like a rough picture. And there's like a large minority who answered like, no, like it's kind of okay. But, you know, maybe most of them weakly disagreed. So they probably think, yes, there are cases. But there's a significant set of researchers who kind of have this different view, it seems, of like the researcher doesn't really bear responsibility for what happens at deployment time. There's a question about ethical and scientific considerations. This one's a little bit weird. Probably it should be discussed offline because I actually don't even know what this means to a lot of people. And oh yeah, another interesting disparity in the result. You might remember the kind of pulse fiasco and like argument between Jan LeCun and Timnit Gebru, right? That like a lot of people kind of participated in this discussion on Twitter and various kind of media about like the role of like data in bias, right? And like this question of like, can you reduce the ethical challenges of building systems to like bias in the data? And people thought this would be a more popular view than it was. So that's another kind of interesting pattern here. Yeah, there are a few more questions, but I think I'll skip through that and I'll also skip through the correlation analysis. But it was good. We had lots of great questions, and you know, you can read the paper for more if you haven't already. So just to quickly summarize, industry is seen as like very widely influential, but the scaling maximalism that is like associated, I think, with industry is like seems to be overestimated as a view within the field. And there's actually a very strong current of faith in interdisciplinary science and doing some like incorporating insights from various different fields, even if maybe we don't have a clear idea of what that should look like. Some of the public controversies like language understanding AGI, they are actually deeply split. They're things that we should probably try and talk about in a way that allows us to reach the whole community. And even though most people seem to think NLP is good, it seems like maybe some very bad outcomes are plausible. Not clear what plausible means. Maybe we should have a conversation about it. Yeah, I think we need to consider like all of the selection biases that I mentioned. So just to kind of recap those a bit, senior academic from the US on Twitter. Maybe not the conjunction of all of those, but each of those independently was a pretty strong bias in our data. It's also probably a bias at AI too. So, you know, your mileage may vary. One interesting tidbit, very few issues were actually more controversial than predicted. So I think this might say something about the kind of amplification dynamics of social media, how we see more controversy probably than there actually is. I would still like exercise caution when interpreting a lot of the results. We had vagueness, words like plausible, what do they really mean? You can compare the questions and meta questions. I think you can do that reasonably well, but really making concrete predictions out of the results of the survey, it's difficult. Yeah, and I already said this thing about like, you know, we're not forecasters, we're NLP researchers. And so I think you can think about the survey as reflecting our signaling behavior. But on the whole, I think like given all of these caveats, actually, it's still a nice way to get a sense of like where is the community at and how we identify ourselves, right? So the hope is that like we can actually just like have more conversations and communicate more productively. And I hope that the NLP field can stay cohesive, especially as things change and as conversations are like tensioned to fracture, if we can kind of keep them together and keep making progress. So yeah, thanks for the time. Yeah.